Howdy everyone, my name's Chris. Today I'm excited to be reviewing a pretty unique and record-breaking lens that I've wanted to look at for a very long time. The Sigma 20mm f1.8 EXDG. The lens is no longer featured on Sigma's website, so it seems to have been recently discontinued. It's record-breaking because it's the widest angle, full-frame camera lens to have a very fast maximum aperture of f1.8. So you're getting a very wide angle with this instrument, and it also lets in a lot of light to your camera. It's also quite cheap to find on eBay these days. I got a brand new copy for only £180 or $300 US, which is a great deal. It used to be a much more popular lens among owners of APS-C digital cameras because of that bright f1.8 aperture and wide angle of 20mm. However, Sigma's 18-35mm f1.8 has taken over that unique role now, while also managing to be a generally incredible lens in every other way. However, this 20mm f1.8 lens is still the fastest ultra-wide-angle lens available for expensive full-frame cameras, where 20mm is a very dramatic and broad angle of view indeed, giving you a stretched perspective in those corners. This footage was taken on a full-frame camera, and here's the same footage on an APS-C camera, where you can see the tighter perspective, an equivalent of 32mm. But the headline really is that maximum aperture of f1.8. This lens lets in lots of light, which is super useful for indoor photography, shooting at nighttime, and video work in general. It can also give you some nicely out of focus backgrounds, despite the lens's wide angle. But this lens is really too wide angle for normal portrait photography, unless you're trying to do something quite creative. The lens does not have image stabilization, but considering its very wide angle, that's not really a huge problem. Let's look at build quality. It's a sizable lens and quite heavy. It has a large 82mm filter thread, so filters will be pretty expensive. However, that front element does not extend or rotate as you change focus, and generally, the whole lens body is tightly constructed with a metal lens mount. However, it does have a quirky and bafflingly designed focus mechanism. On this lens, you switch between auto and manual focus by pushing and pulling the focus ring in conjunction with pushing and pulling a switch. So, in order to have manual focus, you first switch the lens to manual and then pull down the focus ring. Now you can turn the lens's very smooth and precise focus ring. If you push the focus ring up again, it becomes decoupled and you have neither auto nor manual focus. Strange. To enable autofocus, you must now push the focus switch to autofocus mode. Now the autofocus motor will run with the focus ring safely decoupled from the mechanism. The autofocus motor is a little slow and quite noisy, although it seems to focus quite accurately. Be careful though. If you pull the focus ring down again to manual focus, then the focus ring is locked in place, and turning it could force the focus motor around, potentially wearing out the gears. Even worse, if you try to take a picture, which I won't do here, then the autofocus motor slowly forces the focus ring around, making an angry whining noise. The lens's instruction manual is unclear on whether doing this could damage the lens's autofocus motor. I think there's a good chance it will, so that seems to be a major design flaw. Thankfully, Sigma have repented of this horrible lens design these days, and it's not seen anymore. Well, apart from that, the lens is built rather solidly. It comes with a useful lens hood and lens case, and once you've got the hang of its crazy focus system, it works well enough in the field. Okay, let's look at the picture quality. First off, I'll test it on a full-frame camera, in this case a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. At f1.8, there's some very good sharpness in the middle of the image, but contrast levels are a little low. The corners of the picture, well, you can barely see them due to the astonishing levels of vignetting. I'll talk about that more later. Here's the same picture though at a longer exposure. As you can see, those corners are very soft at f1.8, and a bit of pink and green chromatic aberration is visible on contrasting edges. In this case, it's evident on the window frames. I decided to refocus the lens a little, and as a result, you can get a little more sharpness in the corners. This shows that the lens has problems with field curvature. You'll just have to choose between having the lens sharper in the middle of the image or in the corners. If we stop the lens's aperture down to f2.8, then the corners show a tiny improvement, and happily, image quality in the middle of the picture is very sharp indeed, with punchy colours and contrast. Stop down again to f4 for the same quality in the middle, and the corners of the image are finally looking decent, a lot sharper and nice and bright. There's another improvement at f5.6, and the lens stays pretty sharp even up to f11. There is still some noticeable chromatic aberration, noticeable in the window frames. Well, overall, on a full-frame camera, the lens is always nice and sharp in the middle of the image. However, at any aperture faster than f4, the corners are a bit of a disaster zone. Well, let's have a look at the performance on a more common APS-C camera, in this case my 20 megapixel Canon 70D. At f1.8, image quality is acceptably sharp in the middle of the image. However, we also see some ghosting, slightly low contrast levels, and purple fringing on contrasting edges like in this window. So it's not a very clean picture at all. The corners of the image are looking slightly dark and a bit soft. They are sharper than the corners on a full-frame camera though. Stop the aperture down to f2.8 for more brightness and less ghosting. The corners are looking a bit sharper, although unfortunately some pink and green chromatic aberration is now more noticeable in the window frames. But the middle of the image looks fantastically sharp. Stop down to f4 and there's a touch more sharpness, and the corners are a little sharper too. The corners reach their sharpest level stopped down to f8, although chromatic aberration is still pretty noticeable on contrasting edges. Okay, so it's not a completely terrible performance for this lens on an APS-C camera, a bit better than I expected anyway, but it still isn't particularly sharp, just usable really. Alright, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting levels. As usual for a full-frame camera lens, they're not really a problem if you're using an APS-C camera, so we'll look at the full-frame test results. The lens displays a little barrel distortion, which is slightly pinched in the middle. This will be a little noticeable when taking pictures of straight lines. The real issue here, though, is clearly vignetting. Just look at the darkness in those corners. I've never seen anything like it. Stop the aperture down to f2.8 for a little improvement, and stop down to f4 and thankfully it's mostly cleared up. Here are some more examples of that monumental vignetting. Back when the lens was listed on Sigma's website, they claimed that this super wide-angle lens has ensured minimal light fall-off with superior peripheral brightness. Some starfighter must have been smoking crack when they wrote that. This is the worst vignetting I've seen on any camera lens. Remember though, it's not a serious problem if you're using an APS-C camera. Here's something pretty neat though. The lens can focus as close as 20 centimeters to your subject, which means you can get some really dramatic close-up pictures. At f1.8, the close-up picture quality is pretty sharp, becoming very sharp at f2.8. That's a very good performance. This lens freaks out a little bit when working against bright light. Contrast levels remain quite good, but you get lots of interesting flaring patterns, including this giant fiery circle. It's actually very pretty to see, but it's still a major technical flaw in the lens design, which we'd rather do without. Finally, bokeh. This lens can give you a wide and artistically out-of-focus background. However, the quality of that background blur disappoints. At f1.8, the bokeh is quite rough looking, with heavy outlining. Stop down to f2.8 and there's actually quite an improvement, but still, people are buying this lens to use at f1.8, so that's quite a letdown. Overall, although its optical qualities are pretty bad, This camera lens is very fun and unique, and quite affordable, so it might be right up some people's street. Interestingly, its pictures look particularly nice in black and white. However, if you're looking for a lens like this, but with nice picture quality, then you'll be miles better off with the Samyang 24mm f1.4, which I reviewed recently. It's light years ahead of the Sigma lens in every way, and much more capable of getting interesting portrait shots. APS-C camera owners might also want to try the Sigma 18-35mm f1.8, which I mentioned earlier, which is a masterful piece of equipment. The Sigma 20mm f1.8 is, technically, a deeply flawed lens in terms of its optics, but it's also plenty of fun to use, and it can give you dramatic, artistic pictures. Don't pay too much for it, though.